Why my eyes, sir? I've never used them before.
Longlegs and Silence of the Lambs. I think it's rather obvious why I put these two films together, but they are both a lot of fun to analyze, and I think Osgood Perkins' Longlegs will make a lot more sense if I show you the many layers of meaning behind Silence of the Lambs. Longlegs seems to be a rebranding of the Special Agent Clarice Starling character, and maybe even Buffalo Bill too. And both of these stories are filled with many layers of esoteric, occult symbolism, fascinating stuff, so let's dig right into it. Both films, a young female FBI trainee gets assigned to a case involving a serial killer while being mentored and seasoned by her superior officer, and you soon come to realize who is the better teacher, who are these young rookie agents learning from more. Something I'd like to call your attention to in almost every horror film, whether it involves demons or aliens or ghosts or homicidal maniacs, most of them have a common feature: the attack on the traditional family. It's either an attack on religion or the traditional family or both. There is always some formidable, dark outside threat that swoops in to completely tear apart a family, and God is not there to save them. This is the narrative. And in almost every case, Satan wins the battle. He comes out the victor. Move forward to Longlegs, and you will see Satan working through the father figure, who then proceeds to do, the devil's dirty work by destroying his own family. A good example of this was with The Shining, Grady passing the torch to Jack Torrance. But this dynamic just drives home. It just keeps stomping in this idea that to end the patriarchy, just keep inserting the satanic narrative into these men, into these fathers, and they'll tear their own families apart. They'll get the job done themselves. Every horror, alien abduction, poltergeist, demon possession film hones in on the traditional family and uses the forces of evil to tear it to shreds. Are there any happy endings here? No. Do these families come away healed and refreshed and carry on with their lives? No, they do not. They come away traumatized and forever changed. And it's as if they narrowly escaped the clutches of the devil, who forever is in this position of power and authority over them. This is industry formula for the commercial horror film genre. Another common element is this notion of trauma attracting the dark force. The characters in the film, very often generational, have experienced trauma in some form that opens them up to these dark forces, as if trauma is the gateway that allows various categories of demonic entities to enter into the lives and even the souls of these vulnerable characters. And you'll even see this in the alien abduction films. In almost every one of them. Whoever's getting abducted, it goes back generations. And it goes forward generations. Like a familiar spirits that attach themselves to people and families. And I would add that when you see films of this nature that feature a vulnerable young female character who has experienced trauma, and then she goes onward to come face to face in warfare, in battle with a powerful demonic entity, or an alien, or an angry poltergeist, or a homicidal maniac, or even Satan himself. In these films coming from the quote-unquote industry, in my opinion, the narrative then becomes enmity. Spoken of in the book of Genesis, chapter 3, verse 15, the verse explains, and God is speaking to Satan here, quote, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel," end quote. And an interesting note about this verse, notice that it is Jesus who is the he that will crush Satan's head, not the woman. The woman does not do the crushing. But for a story written by a Satanist or a Luciferian or a Freemason or any garden variety occultist or esotericist, a film that depicts this enmity with Satan, engaging in battle with the woman, and sometimes it's even a female child. I mean, we saw this in films like The Exorcist, where it's a child that's forced to come face to face in battle. But again, when you see a woman, a young, vulnerable woman, and is forced to go to battle with a formidable demonic force or dark force, the Aliens franchise was a good example. Ridley Scott's Prometheus, where the female lead, possessed by the alien, performs an bort, if you know what I mean, on herself to rid herself of this alien. I mean, it's ghastly. The theme becomes enmity. The battle is between Satan and the woman. The industry will always put forward a Freemasonic, esoteric spin, and in cases like these, it makes the woman the enemy of Satan. Satan is at war with the woman. And when you look at it from this point of view, many things going on in the culture today will begin to make sense. Oftentimes, you will see this weird, creepy dynamic between the young female lead and the force of darkness, and she is left completely on her own. And it's made worse by a toxic relationship with the mother, who has also experienced trauma. And in almost every film of this nature, the mother is portrayed as this, crazed, loony religious nut. And dangerous, a dangerous, crazed, lunatic religious nut. The one person in the whole world that should have the daughter's back is the mother. I mean, the father too, but when the mother abandons you, it's like the worst possible thing that could happen to a young woman. It's the worst form of abandonment, like we saw in films like Carrie, or in films like The Witch, where in a family of Puritan pilgrims, the oldest daughter, an innocent, was relentlessly abused, cruelly abused by her mother, and completely abandoned by her father, who turns a blind eye to the abuse. And of course, in the middle of all that comes Black Phillip, the devil, in the form of a goat. He's in the midst. This story is not just about being oppressed. It's about being abused by religion. Religion that has turned heartless and fanatical and legalistic. And yes, that happens, but it's certainly not the norm. And the only way to free herself and become empowered is to, off everybody in the family and then make a pact with her liberator, who is Satan.
What's that like the taste of butter? A pretty dress. Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Yes. And then she goes on to become, a powerful witch of the wood. This movie was absolutely celebrated by the members of the Church of Satan and certain feminist groups.
I'm Jax Blackmore, national spokesperson of the Satanic Temple. We live in a Judeo-Christian society, so concepts and embodiments of evil and embodiments of good are part of the imagination of Americans. The witch was kind of the handmaiden of Satan. It took a life of its own because it's really the manifestation of evil in female form. It is my hope that we can encourage people to see this film and really undergo a transformation and inspire a satanic experience.
Ed and Lorraine Warren, the Warrens, responsible for the story of The Conjuring, became famous for pushing these incredibly false, demonic narratives onto mainstream consciousness with stories like the Amityville Horror. And in the Amityville Horror, it was the dad who became possessed and was a menace towards his own family. He gets Jack Torranced, if you know what I mean. And the haunting comes on the heels of Ronald DeFeo, who marched through his house one night and, shot holes through his entire family. And the Poltergeist movies, the Poltergeist franchise, which were among their first projects. And if you remember in Poltergeist, this little one battles face to face with a demonic entity that entered into a religious fanatic, and at different points in the story, the dad becomes possessed and then gets the Jack Torrance effect. Same story over and over. Lorraine Warren claimed to be a clairvoyant and a medium, and she and her husband claimed to be expert demonologists and paranormal investigators, and then they went on to found the New England Society for Psychic Research and opened an occult museum where the possessed doll Annabelle is on display. And they repeatedly claimed themselves to be Christians, and I'm sorry, they were the farthest thing from it. Of course, the brilliant story of Silence of the Lambs, part of a series of books penned by Thomas Harris, the dark force is removed from the supernatural, biblically connected realm and moves it over to humanism, and in this case also transhumanism. If there's an evil force at work here, there's nothing supernatural about it. The disturbed pathology is scripted to come from extreme childhood trauma and a toxic Western culture. This then begs the question, what makes Western culture so toxic? That it makes psychopaths. Why do some people come away from trauma and the culture as workers of good and others as instruments of evil? What defines good and evil? And is there a fine line between the two? Clarice is the young, gifted apprentice being thrown into advanced operations while being both mentored and exploited by her superior. The dynamic of Crawford and Starling is master-apprentice, teacher-student, and even a little father-daughter vibe going on, never mind the hints of a mildly erotic undertone. The dynamic between Starling and Lecter, however, is the same, but flipped on the dark side. This is all part of her quote-unquote training, but training to become what exactly? And who is the better teacher?
That expires in 1 week. You're not real FBI, are you?
I'm still in training at the academy.
Jack Crawford sent a trainee to me.
Yes, I'm a student. I'm here to learn from you.
The Cipher is an important part of Freemasonry, dating all the way back to the Knights Templar. A cipher is an encrypted message or record or secret rite hidden in a code. Freemasons used the cipher to keep records and rites private and for correspondence between lodge leaders or brothers. So between the use of ciphers, the hand signs, and the many symbols, these are the ways that they get encrypted messages to their leaders and brothers. Freemasons love their ciphers, and of course Hannibal Lecter, everything he communicated was buried inside puzzles, ciphers, anagrams, and bits of information hidden in plain sight. And both Starling and Lecter share a backstory of childhood trauma. Starling and the death of her father, being taken in by relatives on a sheep farm, the screaming of the spring lambs at the time of slaughter. Clarice remembers the screams, sounding like that of a child, that wakes her from her slumber. Perhaps the hint of a deeper narrative here. Hannibal Lecter's backstory also includes childhood trauma, which we learn when Lecter experiences a flashback. Born into a wealthy, aristocratic family that dates back to the 14th century, his father, a count and descendant of the warlord Hannibal the Grim, who was a grand master and crusader of the Teutonic Order, which was a sect of the Knights Templar. His mother was descended from two elite Italian bloodlines who ruled areas of Italy for over 250 years. And Thomas Harris also suggested that Lecter may have descended from the Machiavelli bloodline, dating back to the 12th century. However, his father's castle was overrun by military forces. The estate bombed and destroyed. His parents and most of the servants killed. Hannibal and his sister, only small children at the time, were held captive, and after the food supply was gone, his sister was taken and eaten, but Hannibal managed to escape. Severely traumatized by the event and his sister's gruesome death, explaining years later that it completely destroyed his faith in God and cemented the belief that the world was utterly unjust and run only by savage animals. Later, in that singular flashback, an earlier vision is engaged. Lecter sees his baby sister being given a bath by her nurse. The young Hannibal brings her a gleaming purple eggplant, which he has cut from its vine, symbolic of both an infant and a phallus. Lecter sees the world split between the innocent and the savage, and, fearing his own annihilation, suffers a psychotic break. Lecter, who was once prey, has now become predator. and does this to satisfy his pre-existing Freudian ancestral urges, as well as to quiet the extreme anxiety caused by the gruesome death of his sister. Now remember, Hannibal Lecter is cultured and refined. He's an aristocrat, but he's also vampiric, a ruthless monster. And who are Lecter's victims? They fall into 3 categories. The first are the panzers who, red-rummed and then consumed his sister. The second group are rude, corrupt, unrefined, authoritarian jerks or bullies in the community who have one way or the other crossed his path. Quote-unquote free-range rude, he called them, thinking of them in animal terms, as they were all of much lower intelligence and status than himself. Even Clarice, in his opinion, was only one step away from being poor white trash. Or his victims fell into the third category, which were members of the elite class, who were just as deviant and disturbed and depraved as himself, like Mason Verger. Verger was the sole heir to the Verger meatpacking dynasty, some big corporation. And Verger's backstory reveals that he was a deviant since childhood, in which the author gives the very strong impression that these elites and their bloodlines, they are literally born monsters. But none of these people are Nazis. So why does he exact revenge on these types of silly, frustrating, annoying people? While Lecter's disturbing pathology was created by detestable fascist savagery, in his view, his own kind, the aristocrat, the elite, is just as savage and loathsome. Lecter has no virtuous platform, ideologically or politically, from which to stand. He carries no counter-ideology. Hannibal only finds value in, aesthetic refinements and leading certain sheep to the slaughter, if you will. There isn't even a category for Hannibal Lecter. There's no place, no box where he belongs, politically or ideologically or otherwise. Or is there? In my analysis, Hannibal Lecter is the Joker, the wild card, the clown. He is the ultimate nonconformist. He's the anti-hero. He is Albert Camus' The Stranger, the absurd man, the rebel. Now stay with me here, this is getting a little deep. I want you to understand what exactly is at the core of this line of thinking. I want you to get this, because it explains so much. Fascism is everyone's enemy. There's no arguing that point. But so is communism. And Thomas Harris brilliantly keeps Lecter politically unaffiliated. And here's my analysis as to why. From the postmodernist point of view, of which this story is obviously written, it's illogical to place him in either category. He can be neither a fascist or a communist. He is the grotesque product of the former, making him unqualified for the latter, at least according to the author. If Hannibal Lecter represents the absurd man, which I think he does, Albert Camus, lifelong communist, early architect of globalism and absurdist philosophy, argued that in the absurd existence of man and the irrational state of the world, the only recourse the absurd man has, besides, ending himself, is to rebel, to revolt. But rebel and revolt against what or whom? Camus was a globalist, a communist, so for him, God doesn't exist. So the absurd man must rebel against the absurdity of this existence, where a man is born, lives in an irrational state of being, and then dies. In an academic journal titled Camus' Absurd Man, A Metamorphosis of Milton's Satan, the author explains, quote, "Since God does not exist, according to Camus, in the myth of Sisyphus, what the absurd man rebels against is, quote-unquote, le monde. As sin is the awareness of separation from God, so the absurd is the awareness of separation from the irrational universe. If Camus could unlock the secrets of the universe to know the unknowable, he could then dominate it. Le monde would no longer be chaos, but a universe ordered by the mind, hence refutable and under his control. He uses Satan, the ultimate rebel, as the example, as Satan's sin was to want to usurp God's preeminence by penetrating its meaning and then subordinating it. In an academic journal titled Albert Camus, Metaphysical Revolt, Gnosticism, and Modern Cinema, the author explains how Camus applies Gnosticism to his philosophical foundation for rebellion and revolt. Quote, in his interpretation, Gnostics incarnate the spirit of proud rebellion and protest against a God deemed responsible for human suffering and death. Modern receptions of ancient Gnosticism tend to highlight Gnostic nonconformism, especially admiring the alleged Gnostic freedom of mind, otherwise known as liberation, and revolt against standard values and norms. Depending on the scholar, Gnostic revolt has been seen as directed towards either world rulers in general and the God of the Old Testament in particular. It has been considered as inverting ancient patterns of knowledge transmission, rejecting the standard cultural values of ancient society, representing a protest exegesis, and rejecting ancient philosophy or else upsetting contemporary ethics. Such an understanding of ancient Gnosticism presents Gnostics as anarchists, as rebels who romantically reject the yoke of a life of alienation, governed by suffering and limited by death. And this is why you see common knowledge and archetypes and religious symbols being inverted. Inverting things, turning them on their face, is part of this revolt, is part of this rebellion. And quite frankly, it's mind control, social engineering. This level of rebellion is anarchy on steroids. It's about as satanic as one can get. And this is the thinking and the worldview, the ideology, the religion. It's a satanic transhumanist religion, really, of people like Klaus Schwab and Yuval Noah Harari and Silicon Valley, the CERN collective, that are the big globalists trying to take power over the whole world. Camus, in his book The Rebel, writes, quote, metaphysical rebellion is the movement by which man protests against his condition and against the whole of creation. Revolt gives value to life, end quote. And you know, Aleister Crowley was also an absurdist and a Gnostic nonconformist, and he wrote about it in the Book of Lies. Crowley asserted what he called, quote-unquote, onion peelings. Quote, the universe is the practical joke of the general at the expense of the particular. The various rings of disciples then cry and laugh, one to each ring, depending on whether they interpreted what was said as the universal sorrow or the universal joke, end quote. But the character of Hannibal Lecter lends to the theories of the School of Frank and their globalist revisionist Marxism that introduced a very controversial but widely accepted theory to Columbia University. The theory postulated that the patriarchy, the traditional family structure, and its dynamic, its morals and values, its faith in God and country, its patriotism, turns people, they believed, into, highly neurotic and psychopathic fascist monsters that go on to ruin society and ultimately ruin the entire world. This theory was introduced and detailed in a book penned by communist and Marxist philosopher Theodore Adorno and a few of his colleagues, titled The Authoritarian Personality. Now stay with me, this is going deep, we're going in. The traditional family dynamic, according to this theory, the patriarchy, the father as the head of the household and so on, according to Adorno, makes you insane and therefore creates children who become insane and ultimately fascist, highly neurotic, authoritarian monsters who go on to spread ghastly injustice throughout the world until humanity becomes something utterly unrecognizable. All of this is nonsense. It's complete and utter hogwash, and it's diabolical in its gaslighting. Adorno asserted that the authoritarian personality can be identified by a list of traits that he theorized resulted from childhood experiences in the traditional family. The traits include the following: a strict adherence to conventional values, authoritarian submission, in other words, if you obey your parents or you are a law-abiding person, an aversion to creativity and imagination, religious superstition, toxic masculinity, adhering to strict sexual morality, etc., and so on. So basically, if you're normal and conventional and traditional and good and believe in God and follow his morals, according to Adorno and his colleagues, you are insane. So basically, Hannibal Lecter becomes the embodiment of Adorno's theory, sort of taken to the extreme. Hannibal is the product of the fascist authoritarian personality in the irrational, godless world of the absurd. The mission of Crawford and the intelligence agency is to craft the psychological profiles of people like Lecter and then build a database. Lecter becomes an intelligence asset because he is a brilliant psychiatrist, as well as one of the most heinous serials since, like, Jack the Ripper. The very idea of the serial, the terminology and the concept of profiling came out of this agency, if this is not fiction. At the height of the counterculture, out of the clear blue sky, serials started crawling out of the American landscape like scattering cockroaches when the kitchen light snaps on. The details of their crimes, along with their psychological profiles, were introduced to the general population. Levels of depravity most people never thought possible, now suddenly part of mainstream consciousness. We had already been introduced to the Manchurian Candidate, like the two men that you see pictured here, and now we were being introduced to another type of mind-controlled assassin, and most likely contract serials, like Berkowitz, the Son of Sam, Bundy, Gacy, the Manson family, a nice Camus-style inversion of the traditional family, the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, outspoken Satanist and devotee of Anton LaVey, and whom Zena LaVey, Anton's daughter and her husband at the time, visited him right after he'd been incarcerated to inform him that her father's Church of Satan and its members send their blessing and that he had been made an honorary member. Incidentally, Ramirez's cousin, who had taken him under his wing, was reported to be a Phoenix assassin in Vietnam, and many of these notorious serials utilized many of the same torture campaigns on their victims as the Phoenix assassins. I just watched an interesting interview with Zena the other day where she discusses her disillusionment with her father's church and eventual abandonment of it.
And interestingly enough, actually, because I knew Richard Ramirez at the time too.
Just tell people who he was.
Richard Ramirez was a serial killer, a serial murderer in Los Angeles in the 80s, who self-identified as a Satanist, and he was a follower of my father's. He's somebody that, the present-day Church of Satan wants to pretend there was no connection to. But if you are a true religion, you can't have that kind of selectivity. So then that brought to mind philosophical questions. And if we are supposed to be this kind of anti-religion or a counter-religion, what purpose does that serve, and to who?
But the question lingered, are these psychopaths born or are they made? And speaking in terms of a psyop, all of these individuals were profiled to have been made into monsters by early trauma. They were the product of cold, detached, authoritarian, overly religious, absent or abusive parents in a world driven by the empty promises and extraordinary pressures of chasing the American dream. But when investigators started looking into the backstories of these people, in most cases, this wasn't true. All of the notorious ones, outside of like Ramirez and Gacy, proclaimed that they came from relatively normal backgrounds.
My parents, my relatives, had no knowledge of what I was doing. They're absolutely not responsible for any of it in any way, because I always believe the lie that evolution is truth, the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime, and when we died, that was it. So the whole theory cheapens life. If a person doesn't think that there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges?
Watching the movie Exorcist 3 was also part of his ritual. It put him in the mood for murder.
I felt so hopelessly evil and perverted that I actually derived a sort of pleasure from watching that tape. The person to blame is sitting right across from you. That's the only person.
What they all had in common was that they most likely did not operate alone, were tied to cults, and exhibited disturbing behavior from a very young age. Manson's mother was a petty criminal, but Charles was raised by his grandparents, his grandmother, whom he has always said was a stable force in his life. Bundy, the same thing, raised by his grandparents, who early on Bundy described as fine, well-respected people. His grandfather was a deacon of their church, only to change his story later on, leaving those who knew these people bewildered at these wild accusations. If you watched my analysis of the movie White Noise, I detailed how the author, Don DeLillo, also a devotee of Camus, who had a penchant for this activity, which I call the Big T, also wrote a book about this guy, titled Libra, which was classified as a work of historical fiction. In the book, he describes a fictional psychological profile that makes Ozzy here not only a CIA patsy involved in a conspiracy, but the product of a corrupt Western culture and capitalist society. Ozzy's overtly communist political views caused him untold difficulties fitting into American society. He is written to have been raised by a single mother and then enlisted in the military in the 1950s and then defected to the Soviet Union, aligning with the KGB. When he returned to the States, he is profiled to be the perfect scapegoat, the fall guy for a conspiracy. DeLillo depicted him as this misfit anti-hero, this tragic result of traditional American society. If you've read Dave McGowan's book, and you can see the title of it here on the screen, he explains that it basically boils down to two very dark agendas that are deeply intertwined, and the traditional family has nothing to do with it.
Your take, are you seeing this as something also that, I hate to say it, I mean, it may not be the best term for it, but is this also kind of weaponry that is somewhat unleashed against the population?
I see it very much as being that, yeah. I see it as being basically, I guess you could say a psychological warfare tactic, very much along the lines that terrorism is used, in that it's a vehicle of sorts for instilling fear in people, and it's all about control through fear. I mean, that's the basic operating principle of our government. You strike enough fear into people, and they're going to run to Big Brother for protection. The serial killers play very much the same role. I mean, very few things strike fear into people's hearts the way that serial killers do. It's very much sort of a created phenomenon that is used as a vehicle for social control.
Was there an event, was there a particular individual who obviously had a reign of terror that finally made you want to take a look into this? Because this is not a very pleasant subject, no doubt about it. I mean, it's as, abysmal as a Nietzschean event, but was there something that happened out there that made you finally say, you know what, I want to take a look at this?
Yeah, there was actually. George Bush, and very few people realize this. What they do realize is that he was the governor. He basically green-lighted more executions during his tenure as governor of Texas than any governor in any state in the history of the Union. I mean, he is America's premier hanging governor, so to speak. But what they don't know is that he actually did issue one and only one pardon out of the, I think, 153 cases across his death as governor, and that was for a gentleman by the name of Henry Lee Lucas, a guy who at various times confessed to up to like 6 torture, mutilation, all the standards that you find in these cases, and yet out of all the people who came before George Bush to have their cases reviewed, he was the only one granted a pardon. And I got a lot of feedback on that from people who said, well, why would he do that? Well, what do you have a theory about why he would have done that? And at the time, I really didn't. So I decided to look into it, and what I discovered in researching his case was that he had once written a book, or assisted it. He was largely illiterate, but he had basically told his story to another gentleman who had put it out as a book, a very obscure book entitled The Hand of Death. And what Henry claimed is that what looked like a series of random killings were actually basically contract killings, that he was killing on behalf of a cult, and that his victims were in fact targeted for specific purposes, and that his job basically was to make them look like random, senseless killings, when in fact many of them had specific motives. Around that same time, I happened to, I think it was referred to me by someone or something that knew, that I was delving into this research, a copy of Maury Terry's book, The Ultimate Evil, which is an alternative study of the Son of Sam case, David Berkowitz, in which he presents a very similar scenario, which is that David Berkowitz was actually just one of many sons of Sam, and that he was acting on behalf of a cult of individuals, and that basically he became the fall guy to cover up the involvement of all these various other individuals. And that led me to book The Family by Ed Sanders about the Manson case, which had other parallels. And then I stumbled upon a couple cases in Europe that had been reopened, the Monster of Florence case, which had recently been reopened at the time that I was doing this research, because evidence had surfaced that those were not the work of a single individual, but were in fact the work of a cult of individuals. All of your standard high-profile guys that everybody knows, you know, the Ted Bundys, the John Wayne Gacy's, Jeffrey Dahmers, Hillside Stranglers, and those led me to various other cases, and ended up researching, I don't know, some 3 dozen or so, or maybe more, individual quote-unquote serial cases. And what I began to realize is that there was a completely different way of looking at this whole serial killer phenomenon than the way that we are conditioned to look at these people.
McGowan's book gets into black ops conducted through military intelligence at the hands of men like Michael Aquino, Lieutenant Colonel of the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Department, who specialized in psychological warfare, and founder of the satanic cult Temple of Set. McGowan explains, quote, Aquino was identified in court by the mother of a victim as being a key player in a nationwide PED ring. McGowan moves beyond the narrative of the individual psychopath in an isolated incidence of his own madness and exposes dark intersecting covert operations, revealing that many of the most notorious serials may have been created specifically to fulfill dark agendas, and some of them, the casualties of MK Ultra, simply unleashed onto the population. When we think of the fictional Hannibal Lecter as an intelligence quote-unquote asset, it points a beacon precisely at this. Lecter becomes, in a sense, a handler. Lecter seemed to have the inside track on many of these men. Many of Lecter's patients, who were mostly referred, they all knew each other.
Dr. Lecter, whose head is in that bottle?
Why don't you ask me about Buffalo Bill?
Well, do you know something about him?
I might if I saw the case file.
Why don't we talk about Miss Moffat? You wanted me to find him?
His real name is Benjamin Rasmail, a former patient of mine, whose romantic attachments ran to, shall we say, the exotic. I did not kill him, I assure you, merely tucked him away very much as I found him.
If you didn't kill him, then who did, sir?
Who can say?
And they all engaged in the same depraved practices. Of course, Buffalo Bill is the novice that fails at his task, largely due to Lecter's interference.
His dress, makeup, Rasmussen was a transvestite.
In life? Oh no. Garden variety manic depressant. No, I just think of him as a kind of experiment. A fledgling killer's first effort at transformation.
In the book Hannibal, it's revealed that novice Buffalo Bill had been introduced to Mason Verger, who was mentoring him. It's networked, and they are all practicing the same Gnostic, satanic philosophy, attempting to transform themselves into the likeness of Lucifer, into a god, utilizing the esoteric, satanic philosophy of the Baphomet. In the case of David Berkowitz, the son of quote-unquote Uncle Sam, he used this symbol in his letters. This symbol is associated with the teachings of the Process Church of the Final Judgment. The symbol reflects the union of opposites at the intersection of crossroads. The cross represents Christ, the S is for Satan, on the left is the female symbol, on the right the male, the perfect union of opposites, symbolizing achieving divinity, divine status. Berkowitz was one of many sons of Uncle Sam, acting on behalf of a satanic cult that was strikingly similar, if not directly involved, with the Process Church. The Process Church of the Final Judgment, a splinter group from Scientology, was a psychosocial experiment that began in the UK but migrated to the States in the mid-60s. While they venerated 4 quote-unquote gods, they did not see them as literal supernatural beings, but rather as Jungian archetypes that exist within each human personality. Manson and his family were considered to be members of the Process Church, or at the very least followed its teachings, which brought a lot of negative attention to it, contributing to it either dissolving or, in my opinion, moving more underground. The Process teachings were apocalyptic in nature, believing, as many Gnostic anarchists who came before them believed, that it was their responsibility to bring about Armageddon, where these 4 separate forces would be unified in the last days. And of course, the vehicle for accomplishing this task was to create mind-controlled assassins who would comb the earth, committing acts of the Big T, first and foremost overthrowing the Big G. The quote-unquote Reverend Jim Jones was a prime example of this. He was a Marxist who created a cult, who portrayed himself as a religious leader, a reverend, in order to create mind-controlled assassins that would overthrow the Big G. Take a listen.
There shall be no need for gods, any other kind of ideology, ritual, tradition, and religion. The opiate of the people shall be removed from the consciousness of mankind. There shall be no longer further need for anything religious when freedom comes. There will be no need for concerns about the tomorrows, because every day will be heaven. We will build the heaven that man has suppositionally dreamed about. We will have the heaven that we have been taught by the white masters will one day be given to us, that we might be able to shine somebody's shoes in the throne room. But we shall have our freedom here and now. It's marvelous. And in the meantime, I come in the phenomena of religion to get people out of religion. I claim the very God of heaven in all its might and fullness, all the power that you said God had. I have come to make one final dissolution, one final elimination of all religious opinion. There's no room in the consciousness of truth for religious opinion. And until I have eradicated it from the face of the earth, I shall do all the miracles that you said your God would do and never did. I shall come and heal you all the diseases that you prayed for that never happened.
My name is Claudia Norris, and I'm a revolutionary, and I would like it to open this country right now.
My name is Billy Black. I'm a revolutionary. I like to oppose the government right now.
I am a revolution. I would like to open country. Roy Harris.
My name is Stalin Jackson. I'm a revolutionary. I would like to destroy this country tonight. I keep my and I am ready at any time.
What the hell do you think ought to be done with your, just tell us right quick, one line, what do you think should be done with your relative?
To be a nice, well dinner prepared for them and all of them, because none of them no good.
That girl don't dislike her family.
And I would personally like to every vein and throat and muscle in her body.
The Process Church taught that humanity was evil, that the profane, that humans were the rot, the devils, the scourge upon the earth. While the ideological mechanism might differ slightly between the groups, they all share this core idea that ultimately the divine union of opposites launches the Luciferian New Age. Humanity must transform from its evil, profane state to the Baphomet if it wants to continue to be allowed to exist on the earth. Thinking of cults like this as experimental psychological operations, which most of them were, McGowan was asked why characters like Manson were unleashed upon the general public. Take a listen.
A lot of people were kind of surprised by it because prior to that, my writings were, I don't want to say more mainstream, but they were not really as far off the beaten path as this book took, which, the threads running through that are ones of mind control and satanic cults and occult groups and all this kind of weird stuff that's normally thought of as being kind of the province of right-wing conspiracy theorists, where I have always thought of myself as being solidly on the left. And so it caught a lot of my readers by surprise that I had what they thought was, taking this kind of a change of direction. And a lot of what I find I consider to be disinformation and nonsense, but, the more I looked into this, the more I realized that there was, pretty solid documentation.
Would there have been any kind of consortium or group objective they were trying to achieve, or was this just some kind of also experiment to dry run a way of creating terror and see how it all works out? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. I'm not really sure, to be honest. The Manson case was more, I was actually aware of it at the time, and in part, one of the objectives being pursued there was the discrediting of the whole hippie and hippie commune type movement. It was basically a way of saying, well, look at this, these aren't these peaceful hippie communes that we've been led to believe. These people are mass murderers, And I think at the same time, what was playing out was what was that group called? The Symbionese Liberation Army, with the whole, kidnapping of Patty Hearst and all that. And that group was quite obviously an intelligence front. I mean, all of the people, the main principal people involved in that were like former police informers and former FBI affiliates. this operation. And I think it was kind of a two-pronged strategy there with the Manson family sort of discrediting the hippie communes and the Symbionese Liberation Army sort of discrediting the more radical groups like the SDS and the Weather Underground and whatnot that were, in operation at that time.
But I think he gets it wrong here. He admitted that he leaned left, so he may be especially blind to the real order of business, which was, in my analysis, to create mind-controlled assassins and big T revolutionaries that would upset and overthrow everything in conventional society. The hippies weren't doing it. They didn't pull it off. They couldn't make it happen. The SLA were not a front group attempting to discredit the hippies. That's utterly absurd. They were open and vocal about who they were, and were a much more organized version of what we know as this group today. Going back 4 centuries to the early Rosicrucian pranksters, they saw themselves as counterculturalist revolutionaries. As Gnostic nonconformists, they are pranksters, agents of chaos. They are neither the left nor the right. They are like Hannibal Lecter. They are in a category all of their own, or at least they like to think of themselves this way. When you see things like this symbol being attributed to Buffalo Bill, implying that the bad guy in this story was quote-unquote far right, this is gaslighting extraordinaire. And Michael Aquino, he was one of these.
On this altar is one of a number of daggers, which we may use in our rituals. This one happened to belong to the commanding general of the most elite unit of Germany's infamous SS, which was concerned with black magic and occultism research in general. Anything that it could find that had to do with the origins of the human race, destiny, and humanity.
Even Bowie was one, and vocal about it in his Playboy magazine interview. Quote, "I believe very strongly in the Big F. The only way we can speed up the sort of liberalism that's hanging foul in the air at the moment is to speed up the progress, right-wingy, totally dictatorial tyranny, and get it over as fast as possible. You've got to have an extreme righty front come up and sweep everything off its feet and tidy everything up. Then you can get to a new form of liberalism." End quote.
Remember you had an X years ago and you changed it now to a swastika?
No, I never changed. It's been the same thing all the way along.
Wasn't it always an X?
No, it never was.
What's it stand for?
It stands for whatever I mean it to stand for, and whatever I make it stand for, and whatever I want it to stand for.
But you didn't one time say you were Xing yourself out?
No, that was your newspapers that gave you that.
What does it stand for you?
It stands for many things. And it would take 2 or 3 weeks to explain all the things that I've built.
Can you give me an example?
In the image. Certainly, I can give you an example. The United States flag of America. The rising sun in the Japanese flag. The Star of David. Whatever country or nation or people or cause has always had a symbol.
And that's your symbol?
That's mine. I put that there from 2 or 3 other symbols. I didn't want to put a Christian symbol, and I didn't want to put an Antichrist symbol, and I didn't want to put a pro-communism, and I didn't want to put an anti-thermos-like-a-flop-flop-flop-dops and all that kind of stuff that you say.
But it is a swastika. That would be Germany, wouldn't it?
No, that's not a Nazi. Hitler got that sign from mysticism and reversed it. He did the same thing, only he did it backwards. It's the thought still here, just like the thought that he picked up was there when he picked it up. The thought has always been here since the pyramids have been here, since David and the giant, since the whole thing's always been here.
Like Carrie Thornley, friend of Ozzy here. Thornley was associated with the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which was a psychological experiment. Who went insane due in large part to his MK Ultra programming and taking way too many psychedelics. He was a friend and Marine in the same battalion as Oz. And then later he manufactured a fake religion, almost a parody of religion called Discordianism. And it's not a parody at all, it's an experiment in prankster philosophy. The prankster philosophy of anarchy and chaos with a token venerated deity, the Roman goddess Eris, goddess of discord and strife, the goddess of disorder, which Thornley and his co-founder Greg Hill wrote a book titled Principia Discordia, How I Found the Goddess and What I Did to Her After I Found Her. The first edition was more soberly titled Principia Discordia, or How the West Was Lost. Going back to Absurdism, with Principia Discordia, you are left to decide, as it's suggested in the inside front cover. Is it a joke disguised as a religion, or a religion disguised as a joke? Its contents are self-negating nonsense statements, intended to deliberately scramble your sense of order. It's literary chaos, if you will. But in spite of that, there is a solid Gnostic, neo-paganist underpinning symbolized as the sacred cow, which is no surprise because all these guys were absurdists and surrealists and Gnostic nonconformists. If you ever wanted a deeper insight to the secret society promise of Ordo ab Chao, or order from chaos, this is it. But they're all connected to the Process Church. Burning Man Festival founder was a prankster in a later collective, for example. And the Google founders are devotees of this guy. He was part of the Cacophony Society, a group of pranksters for which the movie Fight Club was based, and whose logo was a hand with 6 fingers, like the Nephilim. And I talk about them in this video. So does the Process Church get the blame for all the serials? Well, yes and no. There were many, many, many subsets and offshoots. At the center of it all, though, was the same principal ideology, and they all shared the same principal Masonic symbols. So there you go. Transformation and illumination, that's the name of the game. Symbolized by the moth, from pupa to butterfly. And if you look at the movie poster, the Death's Head moth hides a tiny rendition of surrealist painter Salvador Dali's photograph, with Dali himself standing before these 7 women posed in the shape of a human skull, almost like the ringmaster of a strange ritual. And you can see Lecter has several mannequins and dolls. Buffalo Bill surrounds himself with mannequins and dolls. And we are to automatically assume that this symbolizes the objectification of his prey. But that's not what it means. What does he do, this man you seek? He covets. It's not objectification, it's dehumanization. If a divine being is the perfect union of opposites, then what's left behind is to be eliminated. And we see this happening in the culture all around us, the erasure of women and common man to be replaced by something new, the Baphomet. And in case you aren't convinced yet that this is a cryptic, esoteric presentation, the film itself is a cipher. Lecter's drawings in his cell. You can see here Pan, the goat god of Greek and Roman mythology, glorified by every esotericist since, the dawn of its institution. And a very William Blake-esque rendition of the Red Dragon, representing both the deviant character from Thomas Harris's first book, who believed the same philosophy, that red-rumming people allowed him to transform into what he called the Great Red Dragon, the Beast of Revelation, the perfect union of evil and liberation. His backstory, of course, is he was ritually and sadistically abused by his grandmother. Thomas Harris's use of the Red Dragon lends to 16th century Elizabethan occultist John Dee, along with his scryer Edward Kelly, who through Enochian magic, a system Dee and Kelly developed after many long channeling sessions during seances, conjured up a demon named Corazon. Corazon, according to Dee, is the equivalent of the serpent in the garden, otherwise known as the devil or Satan. Dee also considered him a watcher. Corazon was a watcher. And being that John Dee was a Kabbalist, Corazon is the equivalent of Samael, the demon of chaos from Kabbalistic lore, that vehemently rebels against God and tempts Adam through the agency of the serpent. 300 years later, Aleister Crowley would attempt to conjure this demon, and successfully, I might add, lending to him becoming possessed, at least for a time, and then going, completely insane from that point forward. Adopting Dee's Enochian magical system, over the course of a month of invocations, he conjured Corazon, the dweller of the abyss, asking the demon in the quote-unquote full terror of the situation, as he put it, whether anyone would be appointed warden during this encounter, and received as answer, quote, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, end quote. The words of Christ upon the cross in his final despair and agony. Don't gloss over that. Even Corazon knows who has authority over him, lending strongly to the authenticity of Crowley's experience. What is diabolically compelling about Corazon, however, when examining both John Dee's writings and Crowley's, Corazon ends up being Yaldabaoth, the evil, poisonous, and destructive god of the Gnostics, the Demiurge. Corazon and the Demiurge are one and the same, bringing the apparent madness of this magical system somehow full circle. In Crowley's own words, quote, "For he is wisdom, and by wisdom hath he made the worlds, and from that wisdom issued judgments 70/4, that are the 4 eyes of the double-headed one, that are the 4 devils, Satan, Lucifer, Leviathan, Belial, that are the great princes of the evil of the world," end quote. Then Crowley wrote the name Babylon, because apparently he can't spell, in the sand with his magical ring, and then lit it on fire to sanctify the place. In his book Tetragrammaton, Donald Tyson writes about the Enochian system, quote, "Once Corazon and his angels gain access through the watchtowers, their mere presence in our world will render it unfit for human habitation by increasing the degree of chaos and disrupting the balance of the natural laws that presently provide stability and order. Corazon will transform our universe into a suitable dwelling place for himself and his ministers, in the process destroying the human race," end quote. And a final note about Silence of the Lambs. In this dynamic of opposites, the yin to Lecter's yang is Agent Clarice Starling. Everyone considers her, the symbolic lamb, the Christ-like messianic symbol of innocence and purity in this story. She's good by nature, and Lecter never was good. He was a monster from birth, but has chosen to transform, and together they make a perfect union. But Clarice is not the lamb, and she is not the messianic or Christ-like figure as most people assume. Christ of the Bible is never considered in these scenarios, in these stories. The Gnostic Christ, yes, but not the real biblical Christ. He is always deliberately eliminated. In Lecter's eyes, Clarice is the Marian figure, the mother of innocence. She is the nurturer and the protector of innocence and goodness, which she carries with her from generations that came before her, and of which Lecter admires greatly. Clarice is not the lamb. If anything, she is the starling. Important in Freemasonry and other esoteric occult traditions, the starling is an instrument of divination, among other things, and in this story, her name becomes a cipher in itself. It connects to ancient Rome, the Roman Empire. Shakespeare often used the starling in his plays. Shakespeare is thought to be alchemist and esotericist Francis Bacon. They are a native bird of ancient Rome. Their massive flocks were observed by oracles, who would watch the formations in order to divine and interpret the wishes of the gods. Is Agent Starling learning to interpret the wishes of the gods? I've seen this in movies like, every apocalyptic movie, like Take Shelter is a good example, The Endless, the movie Dark Skies, the UFO movie. Flocks of starlings working as harbingers of ominous catastrophic events.
There is a storm coming! Like nothing you have ever seen! And not a one of you is prepared for it!
The starling is also a mimic and a bird of superior intelligence. The name Clarice means bright, suggesting not just a light, but also intelligent. It also means clear, as in transparent, unclouded. It seems Osgood Perkins may have wanted to simply rehash and rebrand the Hannibal Lecter story to bring it to the new generation. At the start of the movie, Osgood puts a T-Rex Mark Bolan lyric from his song Bang a Gong. You can see the lyrics here on the screen. This sets the stage. It prepares your mind for the theme of the story. To me, he's basically saying, the girl is pretty. She looks meek and mild, but she's got the teeth of a hydra, and you're going straight into the mouth of this beast. The hydra is a serpent-like creature in Greek and Roman mythology with 9 heads. If you cut off one head, another grows in its place. It's pretty close to the beast of Revelation, or the red dragon, as I've already talked about. This line here in the song probably does not need my input. It's self-evident. This is how Osgood wants you to see her right out of the gate. She's supposed to be highly intuitive, but really what they mean is clairvoyant, a skill probably thought to be cultivated as a result of her trauma.
He's in there.
Why don't you say that?
We should call it in.
No.
No, because we're not going to call it a hunch on our first day out doing this.
Which is also considered an intelligence quote-unquote asset. She's assigned to a series of cases involving families, of course. In each case, the victims were scripted as good, God-fearing church-going people, honest and decent, upstanding members of the community with well-behaved children. What connects each of these cases is a 9-year-old daughter born on the 14th of each month. The scene where Harker is taking a psychological word association Rorschach-type test was interesting to me. She is shown what looks almost like minimalist modern art pieces, as empty of meaning as they could possibly be, and says the word that comes top of mind for each.
Camera, table, lights, tiger.
Camera, table, lights, tiger. Of course, in the room presently is the camera and the table and the lights, but they are off, and yet she adds the word tiger. The first 3 words suggest that she is aware of being in the present moment, in the room, but the word tiger taps deeper into the psyche. Tiger is almost Jungian in its subconscious idealization of how she may perceive her ideal self. Tiger, in esoteric tradition, is a feminine symbol that represents royalty, it represents majesty, it represents strength and ferocity and fearlessness and power. The test continues and the words are door, mother, father, piano.
Door, mother, father, piano.
Piano seems disjointed and doesn't seem to connect to anything in the movie, and I'm guessing it's going to connect to something in the sequel, kind of further nailing down that this chick's psychic. She sees stuff way in advance. The mother image looks almost eonic, with 2 orbs maybe symbolizing the mother and daughter, but the symbol for father is an upside-down triangle, the as below symbol. Then she is asked to pick a number between 1 and 100, which she picks the Masonic number 33.
The number has been generated between 0 and 100 inclusive. What is the number?
I don't know. 33?
She is again asked to choose another number, which she chooses 0, and this is about as Masonic as one can get.
What is the number?
0.
The number 33 is obvious, but 0 is the number of the abyss, the dwelling place of Corazon, the red dragon, the beast of Revelation. The abyss was considered the void, the 0. The number 1, these represent the black and white checkerboard, 0 representing the white, 1 representing the black. The 0 is the feminine, the 1 is masculine. 0 represents the infinite, the nothingness, immortality. The number 9 is a sacred number in esoteric tradition and especially in Freemasonry. Jesus was thought to expire in the 9th hour. Jesus appeared 9 times to his disciples after his resurrection. There are 9 supernatural fruits of the Spirit enumerated by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 4 through 11.
Number 9.
In Freemasonry, the number 9 is looked upon as 3 times 3, 3 being sacred as it represents the Neoplatonic Gnostic Godhead or Luciferian Trinity. Multiplying it times 3 just increases its power, its potency. Jesus was 33 years old when he died on the cross, and thusly, the highest degree one can obtain in Freemasonry is the 33rd degree. 14 is also an important number in Freemasonry and esoteric tradition. It's connected to Osiris, who was cut into 14 pieces, of which the 14th piece was the phallus, and was lost, only to be replaced by Isis, who fashioned a phallus from gold, which she used to resurrect Osiris and then conceive Horus. And Hiram-Abiff, the parallel character in Freemasonry to Osiris. Hiram-Abiff, considered the father of Freemasonry and master architect who helped build Solomon's temple. Of course, Hiram-Abiff is a completely fabricated story, is totally made up. There is no record of him building the temple or any account of him in the Bible or any record of him anywhere ever existing. In the legend, Hiram-Abiff was assassinated and buried for 14 days, then exhumed by order of King Solomon and resurrected so he could then continue to spread the sacred word of Freemasonry onward. It was not forever lost. Hiram-Abiff's death and resurrection is celebrated in the ceremony of the 3rd degree, as he was red-rummed by 3 assassins, represented in the esoteric tradition as 3 alchemical stages of transformation into a divine being, and sometimes symbolized as 3 triangles. Longlegs brings in Dante's Inferno and the 9 Circles of Hell. It's no mystery that Dante was tied to either early Freemasonry in its, embryo stages, very earliest stages, but he was most likely a Rosicrucian. But he was definitely influenced by the esoteric, all evidenced by his writings. Dante's writings are instrumental to the idea of hellfire and brimstone, with demons tormenting the souls of the damned in the lake of fire, which, of course runs contrary to true biblical teaching of hell. Of course, the character Longlegs really needs no further analysis. It's a rebranding of Buffalo Bill. Since this character takes himself out of the story, I'd say that's a pretty clear message that Nicolas Cage isn't interested in starring in any sequels. Cage is reported to have based his character on his real mother, who is publicly known to have suffered, mental illness, and Perkins has said that the movie itself was based on his mother, which, this is a sad testament to both of those relationships. Or it's simply a clever marketing tool. Probably the only part of the story that I found pretty haunting was the strange metal orb put in the heads of the dolls. Dolls, again, symbolizing dehumanization. In the story, Longlegs performs satanic ritual magic that infuses the orb with this satanic energy. The orb is then placed inside the head of each of the dolls, which are sent to the families, that causes the mother and daughters to go catatonic and the dads to be Jack Torranced. If I think of this as a symbol, as a metaphor, I can take it a couple of ways. Simply representing, mind control through satanic ritual, the power of satanic ritual to control minds. But really, it lends more to some kind of a suggestion of a device, almost like a directed energy device, which can do everything they mentioned in the movie, like putting voices in people's heads, causing auditory and visual hallucinations.
What about the ball? It was inside the head. So I've been calling it the brain. The other night I could have sworn it was whispering my ex-wife's name over and over again.
These devices can use, lasers or microwaves to trigger uncontrolled neuron firing and even slowly heating the body to the point of mania, to psychosis, to excited delirium. In an article by National Defense Magazine titled "Doctors Reveal Details of Neuro-weapon Attacks in Havana," quote, "Directed energy weapons intended to disrupt or damage their victims' brains were the most likely source of a series of mysterious attacks, singling out U.S. personnel assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Cuba in 2017. The team of 3 experts concluded that incident was a wide-scale use of electronics to carry out a so-called neuro-weapon attack. Neuro-weapons are an emerging but little understood threat that is compounded by the ease in which they can be purchased on the internet. The effects can be latent, durable, highly disruptive, and attribution is difficult. They have the potential to disrupt everything from individual cells in a body to societies and geopolitics, said Giordano. Those he examined said they were sitting in their homes or the hotel when they suddenly felt the symptoms. They would actually say that if they moved in their domicile, the beam, as it were, would follow them, except the minute they opened the front door, it went off. Such weapons could be used clandestinely against a political leader, for example, to ultimately destabilize a society, which includes cognitions, emotions, and behaviors, in ways that are going to be disruptive on a variety of scales, from systems in the individual to systems in the social and political realm." End quote.